In the last part, Vladimir the Great chose Islam instead of Christianity, forever altering the path of Russia, leaning it away from the Byzantines and towards the Arab and Persian worlds. Since these lands would be under Mongol control for centuries, and their Catholic neighbors disliked them anyway, there isn't as much of a change as you would imagine. The real impact is yet to be seen, as we entered an alternate 16th century, and the Russia we know was meant to officially form and become a key player in European politics. In this scenario, however, Russia is arriving as an Islamic power, another force that Eastern Europe fears, alongside the Ottomans. This is a dynamic that transforms the history of Europe. So alright, if you didn't watch that last video, you're caught up now. There were a few possibilities I wanted to take in for the scenario. Maybe Novgorod remained independent and Christian, forever attempting to defy their Muslim neighbors. 1453, the fall of Constantinople, a moment that shocked the Christian world. Yeah, Eastern Rome hadn't really been relevant for centuries, but this was still a symbolic strike through Christendom, and a moment of triumph for the Islamic world. Like, there are celebrations everywhere over the defeat of the Romans, and in this alternate timeline, Russia would be joining them. But these actions don't mean that the Russians would be in some alliance or loyalty to the Ottomans. Before talking about how Russia gets along with the rest of Europe, how does Russia even get along with the Ottomans? I guess that really depends on how this Muslim Russian state is organized. Is it a similar power structure with a czar or sultan at the top? For the sake of familiarity, let's assume so. The question here is really about what is more influential, religious ties or geopolitical goals. Since the Russians and Ottomans were both Muslim, perhaps they may ally against Catholic Europe, aiding one another to expand even further. The Ottomans might take Vienna, even Italy. Christian Europe might constantly fight for survival. At least that's what some of my YouTube comments suggested. As interesting as it would be to imagine this clash of religions from the 1500s onward, things were never really that black and white. So I guess first, Russia's interest in Europe. This decision to focus on the Volga and Caspian trade shifts Eastern Slavic attention away from Europe. I say that, but there is always the possibility that Russia can still do both. Going down south through the Volga, gaining land on the Caspian coast, obliterating a lot of Khanates. So what really is the difference here? I guess it's the mentality? Maybe there's a faster settlement of Slavs into these regions. The biggest difference is really that this is to take advantage of trade with Persia, especially Safavid Persia, which would have established itself after centuries of various Mongol and Temurian dynasties. This is just temporary though, because eventually Russia will need to confront Europe. They aren't simply going to allow the Polish-Lithuanians or Teutonic Knights to just take this land. While Russia is focusing on the east, they still have to defend in the west, and they were going to eventually clash with the Ottomans. The Ottomans fought with fellow Muslim neighbors all the time, like the Persians or Egyptians. In Islam, two Muslim states technically cannot wage war against one another without a religious justification. And since the Ottomans were Sunni and the Safavid Persians were Shia, they fought all the time. The frequency of these wars are kind of determined by what sect of Islam Russia chooses. It's not like I can enter this all into an equation and get the right amount of conflicts based on faith and politics, so we're gonna just kind of wing it. I'm going to just say there's fewer. I could imagine that Russia would follow Sunni Islam, considering it's the majority sect across the Muslim world. However, keep in mind that the Eastern Slavs shift their attention east, 500 years earlier. Because the Kievan Rus focus much more on the Volga trade with Persia, there might be a large Persian influence here. We've seen it throughout a lot of Turkic and Central Asian cultures, so it's not crazy that it could have happened in Russia too. What I'm getting at is that because of trade, there might be a lot of things that this Islamic Russia takes away from Safavid Persia. Like, maybe Russian art is heavily influenced by Persian art and style. Maybe by the time of the Safavids, they adopt Shia Islam, which seems kind of crazy. Why would they do that? But if they had that amount of a connection to Persia, it's always possible. And also, maybe it's because the Ottomans hold territory across the Black Sea, and even Crimea. If there's going to be an inevitable clash of territory, you don't want to fight with people who follow the same faith as you. Maybe if the Russians followed a different sect of Islam than the Ottomans, they could perhaps take that territory that they've been eyeing. Maybe they could deal with the nuisance that is the Crimean Khanate. The Crimean Khanate was a remnant of the Golden Horde, which had become a puppet of the Ottomans, and for its entire existence, the one thing that kept it alive was slavery. Raiding into Eastern Europe, capturing and killing thousands, and then selling the survivors at the market of Constantinople. This was a legitimate issue for Russia up until the 18th century. In fact, up until 300 years ago, it was the reason why most of Ukraine was sparsely populated. It was deemed the Wild Fields, which I gotta say is an awesome name. If Russia had become Muslim, they could not, under the rules of Islam, be subject to these slave raids. The Crimean Khanate could not have grown so powerful. Now, there still may be battles, but nothing like the depopulating raids that we saw, simply because without slavery, the Khanate isn't as powerful and is able to do less damage to their northern neighbors. I could still imagine major wars between the two, which only damage Russian and Ottoman relations, but this makes the Russians a lot more fond of Persia than the Ottomans. And Persia would be outside of Russia's new territorial interest. The Russians and Safavids may be unofficial friends against Ottoman expansion, always keeping them in check. To the Ottomans, the Russians would be considered enemies of the faith, and almost liberal in their faith by Muslim standards of the time. Like I said, drinking probably still remains a core aspect of Russian society, maybe even the eating of pig to be extra scandalous. As Ottoman rule eventually collapses in the Black Sea, I can anticipate that this land is going right to Russia. In fact, I anticipate all of this land still going to Russia. Now, I know it seems kind of weird that there's almost an inevitability that Russia controls this aspect of the world, but that really comes down to two things: population and geography. Some people imagine Russia conquering these lands like how the Americans took land from the Native Americans. And in some parts that's true, but for a majority of this land, there was just nobody here to claim it. Now, in some parts there were still people here, but this was nothing compared to even the population of the Plains tribes. The way Russia settled this land was by following the natural flow of the rivers all the way east, and setting up forts until they reached the Pacific. China never went that far north. If there was a state that was just as big as Russia in this alternate timeline, doesn't matter what faith they followed, doesn't matter what culture they were, all you had to do was take out a few khanates and then claim the rest. Now, these conquests eventually take on an entirely different light. Being a Muslim power, Russia might claim dominion over all Muslims within Central Asia, or at least at their natural allies. So anytime there happens to be an Islamic revolution by the Uyghurs in Western China, imagine who's coming to their aid. Perhaps because they started moving east so early, the Russians may reach the Pacific a century earlier than in our own timeline. It's quite the stretch to make, but I'm just putting it out there. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's get to the thing you came here for. While I said earlier that I want to imagine Russia as largely unified, I didn't mean all of it was unified, because I think it'd be more interesting to imagine that the Republic of Novgorod somehow remains independent. While on occasion they may fall under greater Muslim rule, we would never see the entire institution wiped out like it was under Ivan the Terrible. Perhaps we could see a series of alternate wars led by Sweden and the Livonian Order, which pushes back and restores Novgorod as an independent, predominantly Catholic region. Yes, I did say Catholic. Well, look, without Vladimir picking Orthodox Christianity, there isn't much of a reason for Novgorod, so far removed from the Byzantines, to also pick Orthodoxy. It's very possible that Catholicism would be predominant for most of the Eastern Slavs. This leads to an entirely different dynamic between Novgorod and her neighbors. In our timeline, we saw a series of wars involving the Swedes, Livonians, and Polish, all Catholic, all trying to capture heretic Orthodox land. But in this alternate scenario, Novgorod could be a Catholic republic, like a northern Slavic Italian city-state, one that is, if anything, constantly fending off attacks from their neighbors, who also happen to be Muslim. Well, not just the Muslims. It's not like Catholics haven't ever fought one another. Over centuries, Sweden and Novgorod would probably compete over Finland. Poland and Novgorod would compete over Polotsk and maybe even the Baltics as well. Novgorod will be in many ways a competing power to both, but also an occasional ally against Islamic Russia. And maybe because there wouldn't be literal holy wars between them, we would see a more peaceful Baltic region. One that allows Novgorod to become stronger than it already was. Perhaps Novgorod might even be as influential as Moscow in this alternate timeline. Well, not as influential, but still a unifying force for Christian Russia. A strong foundational city, but one that isn't based on a tsardom, but a republic. In a way, we'd kind of have two Russias. A primarily Christian republic to the north consisting of Novgorod, Polotsk, and Rostov-Sudol, a state that is incredibly unique even by medieval and Renaissance standards. And to the south, we have a united Muslim Tsardom, or Sultanate. This is the entity that expanded against the Ottomans and took Crimea, one that is influenced by Persian art, one that primarily competes against raiding nomadic khanates, while kind of taking some influence from them. Novgorod would be nothing like this. The fact that Novgorod, as well as Polotsk and Rostov, ever shared a similar history to the rest of the Rus would be a trivia fact few would remember. It'd be seen like Charlemagne once holding French and German lands. While once a part of a common dominion, centuries of faith, inner turmoil, and hostile subjugation has divided these people. It's reflected in their cultural practices, perhaps even their language. And what this leads to is a Novgorod that evolves side by side with trade from Baltic Europe, one that goes farther and farther from their Rus roots. And instead of being attacked by the Livonians, they could perhaps be protected by them. Their Catholic nature may forever make them something to be protected, keeping the city that otherwise was captured by Moscow to be safeguarded. It would remain a key member of the Hanseatic League, and perhaps even develop into a nation-state of its own. In the eyes of the rest of Europe, Novgorod would be their main impression of Russia, while the Muslim Slavs would be often disregarded or seen as just a continuation of the Golden Horde. So since we technically have two Russias now, I think it'd be best to just talk about each individually. Novgorod could evolve to be very similar to the rest of Scandinavia, and yes, that probably includes Protestantism. Once the Reformation occurs, it wouldn't really pay for Novgorod to stick with Roman Catholicism, like, literally. Not only would Novgorod have a far greater history being tied to the Hanseatic League, but it'd have its own foreign policy in relation to the Swedes and Germans. There's a possibility that the Republic may even become Protestant, which sounds incredibly strange, a Protestant republic in Eastern Europe, Ronald Reagan's wet dream, but that is a possibility here. By the time of the 30 Years' War or wars during the Reformation, who's to say that we might not see clashes between Catholic Polish Lithuania and a Protestant Novgorod? Novgorod may still be within the sights of the Swedish Empire. Sweden might be a lot stronger in this scenario. One of the biggest results of Russia picking Islam, and kind of just not existing as we would know it, is that there's a power vacuum from the 15th century on. Empires and states that were beaten back by Russia in our history wouldn't have just sat around being peaceful. They were always players in their own right. In this alternate world, much of Eastern Europe is subject to the whim of either Poland, Sweden, or the Ottomans for at least a few more centuries. And without a united Russia to kind of just come in and sweep them away, these lines on a map that we see as so strange today would become solidified. This could be the basis of alternate nation states. There was already attempts by the Polish to colonize and convert the Ruthenians and Eastern Slavs. Without that previous relationship between Orthodox Christians, it's very possible that they could have been successful. In the north, Novgorod may evolve into a key player in European politics, just never the domineering empire that we saw under Moscow. Perhaps a temporary power, like Sweden. But we can also imagine that this is an alternate origin for northern Russia, and this region then sees the ideas of the Reformation imported through trade. Novgorod could become a hub of philosophy and learning through political thinkers, ones that come to the city to reform their own autocratic societies. But this is really just me brainstorming. What I can mainly imagine is that this republic would be a key player in the Baltic trade, and it would evolve with their neighbors, not apart from them. This doesn't mean that Novgorod would conform to Western European standards. It would have its own distinct, uniquely Slavic approach to governance. The funny thing is, this is a world where the leading states in Eastern Europe are very unconventional compared to the feudal system and kingdoms of the West. Polish Lithuania and the Novgorod Republic would be pioneering a form of government that by our 21st century standards would be ahead of their time. Maybe when Western Europe develops its political consciousness, it wouldn't just be from Italian republics, but in thanks to inspiration from their Eastern contemporaries. While the details for all of this are incredibly vague, it's something interesting to think about. A smaller state that remains distinctly Slavic, but is an incredibly influential force across the European world. This is assuming that nothing drastic changes to transform this development, like the city getting sacked, but I want to be optimistic. Going past this alternate 15th century, Poland-Lithuania might not collapse like it did in our timeline, or, get divided up amongst its neighbors. The lesson here is that if we frankly have a less unified Russia, that means we have a far more powerful Poland. A Poland that, to the Eastern Slavs, is the strongest protector against the Muslim horde. I can imagine that after 200 or 300 years of alternate rule, cities like Kiev or Lviv, formerly Rus settlements, would transform entirely under Polish influence. And Islamic Russia could have taken on multiple forms. The most realistic is that the Kievan Rus would have just collapsed instantly. As interesting as it'd be to simply replace Orthodox Christianity with Islam and still have the same Moscow-dominated Russian Empire, that's just not how it would work out. As fun as it is to imagine the Russians expanding further south because of their new Muslim faith, they would have to compete against nomads who violently controlled the steppes. This would be no easy feat. If there was some Muslim state, it would be clinging to life on the Volga River, and never would really expand too far away from it. What kept the Eastern Slavs together as a cultural group, even if they eventually spoke different languages, was that orthodoxy under Mongol rule. It at least made them distinct enough from their Catholic neighbors, especially the Poles. And a stronger Poland is like such an entirely different scenario that might as well be a different video. That might lead to German unification going in an entirely different direction, or just not happening at all, especially under Prussian influence. Invasion and subjugation forged the Russian identity, and also the identity of people we would come to call Ukrainians and Belarusians. Had that faith been different, we're removing a core aspect of just what made this group the way it is. A Muslim Rus, by adopting Islam, would be adopting Central Asia. They might adopt the identity of the Golden Horde, moving their focus entirely away from Europe. In this alternate world, the Volga and not the Ural Mountains would be the boundary for how Europeans classify the continents. It's all equally artificial, but it's still based in a history of this land being seen as other than the Christian world. Novgorod would be European, while its fellow Eastern Slavs that just happened to be Muslim would not be. I mean, what do you think would have particularly happened? Would there be some alternate World War I where Novgorod tries to fight Sweden over Finland, or Poland captures Crimea from Muslim Russia? It's an interesting thought. What we think of as Europe and not could have been easily changed by a single decision. And what the true ramifications of that decision would be, I'm going to leave up to the comments. As for now, this is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Finally, I've set up my own small business, no longer having to rely on just being a mascot for an alternate history channel. I'll be my own mascot, ship plushies of myself across the country. Oh no, that's how much shipping is? Oh, that's how complicated it is too? I can't do all this on my own. If only there was a solution to my problem. If only there was a solution to my problem. Jimmy, keep it down. I'm trying to ship plushies of myself. Yeah, me too. Don't you have, say, a sponsor that may help out with this problem? Me? What are you talking about? Looks like you both need ShipStation. Oh my god, is that my floating head? Wait, that isn't you? ShipStation is an e-commerce shipping service that helps automate any shipping tasks that you need. Running an online business can be stressful, but ShipStation takes away part of that burden. No, that isn't me. I'm always exhausted by the end of these videos. You're telling me this has happened before? ShipStation integrates everywhere you sell online, be it Amazon, Etsy, Shopify, and more. It's an all-in-one dashboard that oversees all of your marketplaces, perfect for small business owners who don't wish to micromanage every account. You can even automate shipping labels, optimize shipment, and get up to 84% off USPS and UPS rates. I probably should have let off with that, shouldn't I? How does something like this even happen? Is this guy like a ghost? Or a clone or something? It's a mystery to be sure. We should probably send him down to the lab for analysis. Wait, there's a lab now? If you're looking to grow your business, but are too worried about the cost and hassle of shipping, then ShipStation is perfect for you. Over 130,000 companies have grown their e-commerce business, and 98% that stick with ShipStation for a year remain customers for life. Yes, there's a lab. Look, we need to find out what exactly this thing is. The only problem is... No, don't say it. The shipping rates, you know, they are expensive. Open the box. Manage every order from one simple dashboard. Get a 60-day free trial at shipstation.com/althistory. Special thanks to ShipStation for sponsoring the show. You need to be more aware about what happens on your videos. You need to mind your own business. Don't you mean e-business? Ha ha!